My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to address a bit of a Twitter controversy that erupted around the Rings of Power show. Not because I'm just trying to trash Rings of Power more, but because there's actually a much broader lesson that we could all stand to learn here, whether you're fans of Rings of Power, the Peter Jackson movies, or just about any adaptation, really. And that has to do with elves. Some of you may have noticed on Twitter that Ismael Cruz Cordova got into a bit of a controversy because he said something in an interview about trying to be the most elven of any character, and there were a lot of people criticizing this and a lot of people defending this, and it's Twitter, it goes back and forth. Anyway, I wanted to give my thoughts on this because, yeah, he's wrong in terms of describing himself as the most elven character that's ever been on screen. He didn't use those exact words, but that seemed to be what he was getting at. He's not, if you want to look at it in terms of what does Tolkien think of when he thinks of an elf. But it's also true that no other adaptation really gets him right either. And I think that's something that's really lacking in our visual adaptations of Tolkien, is really good representations of elves, because Orlando Bloom's Legolas ain't it either, and really the closest you ever get is maybe the Rankin Bass Hobbit, and then you still have these guys. So, yeah, I mean, the Wood Elves in The Hobbit were really not elf-like at all. Elrond has a big beard, which we know is wrong, and the best that you can say for the Rankin Bass Hobbit is they included the Down in the Valley song, and that's just a background thing that there's no real individual character. So even that really misses the mark, but, the point here is elves are not this race of stoic, one with nature, hyper awesome warrior types. That's not to say that they're not good at being warriors, and it's not to say that they don't love nature and that they can't be, really stoic if necessary, but that's not really, in fact, I'm not even really sure I would say that. I don't think elves are ever really stoic. Ever. But the point is, at no point do you ever get the impression that these are kind of defining characteristics of them. So I wanted to go through some things that we learn about elves in Tolkien's own writings and really kind of set the image of elves right, in the sense of, here's what we should look for if we really want to see a Tolkienian elf on screen. Now, of course, we do have to admit up front that elves have a lot of different types of representations in the stories because they get shown in a lot of different contexts. The context in which we see the Elves of Rivendell is a very peaceful, not very dangerous, or even particularly dramatic setting, and so it makes sense that we're not going to see them at their, fiery warrior type finest. That's really not what we would expect to see in Rivendell. But it does show that elves can be something other than that. The elves that we get from, Peter Jackson's movies and even, the Rings of Power show are really one-dimensional. And if elves are anything, they are definitely not one-dimensional. They are anything but one-dimensional. In fact, one of the defining characteristics, you might say, of elves is that they never lose some of their childlike qualities even as they grow up and gain other qualities, and therefore they are the most multidimensional characters that you could imagine in some ways. So, some examples of this, of course, one I already mentioned. The Tra-la-la-lally song from The Hobbit is a classic in terms of elves being kind of silly jokesters. And this is not the only instance. In fact, one of the things that we get out of The Hobbit is not just them singing about seeming nonsense, but even cracking jokes at the dwarves' expense, although in, good-naturedly. Because one of them even says, to Thorin, "Don't dip your beard in the foam, father. It's long enough without watering it." It's that is so totally not something you would ever see Legolas in Peter Jackson's movies do, or Elrond in Peter Jackson's movies do, or any of the elves in Rings of Power. It's really hard even to imagine any of the elves in the animated either Ralph Bakshi or Rankin Bass versions do. It's really hard to imagine that. Now, I know what you're thinking, some of you. Well, that's The Hobbit. That's before he got really serious in The Lord of the Rings. No. Let's just dispel that myth right off the bat, because in The Hobbit, yes, it is a lot more lighthearted in tone, but it also gets quite serious. But we also see elves joking around and doing stuff like that in The Lord of the Rings itself. For example, our very first encounter with elves in The Lord of the Rings is with Gildor's wandering company in the Shire, and we get some interesting humor out of that, because they've just scared off a Black Rider, unbeknownst to them. They don't know that yet, but Frodo will explain it to them. But whenever they first meet, they hail Frodo by name. Frodo asks, "How do you know who I am?" And they're like, "We know lots of stuff." And he's, what is the meaning of all these hobbits walking around at night in the middle of, nowhere, basically? And Frodo ends up saying, "Oh, we're just, kind of enjoying an evening stroll, and we'd love to join you." And their response, I kid you not, is, "But we have no need of other company, and hobbits are so dull." They laughed. So they're clearly joking at the hobbits' expense. And then, there's more than that to it, too, because they also get other jokes in here as well. For example, when Frodo greets Gildor in his own language, Elin Sila Lumen Omenti Elvo, Gildor then responds by saying, "Be careful, friends," cried Gildor, laughing. "Speak no secrets. Here is a scholar in the ancient tongue." So again, this one isn't really a jab in the same way that the other one kind of was, but it is a lighthearted joke. He's really making fun of elves in the sense of, it's like they're not really actually speaking any secrets anyway, but it's just a funny way of saying, complimenting Frodo is what he's doing, but it's doing it in a humorous way. Gildor and his group are not the only ones who do this either. Later we will see Legolas making jokes about finding the sun on Caradhras. He's going to say, if Gandalf could, just melt the snow, just basically turn his staff into a torch, he could just melt our way out. And Gandalf, of course, being tired and grumpy at this point, is like, yeah, and if elves could just hop over mountaintops and find the sun. Well, later, of course, Boromir and Aragorn start just plowing through the snow the hard way. And then Legolas, decides, what? I'm just going to run on the top of it because I can do that. And he says, "I go to find the sun!" He's clearly being lighthearted about the whole thing. And not entirely appropriately either, I might add. Because literally everybody else around him is in danger of freezing to death. And he's just like, it's no big deal. This is the kind of thing that you can see elves doing. It's just so goofy. And they make jabs at each other, and they make jabs at other people. They make jabs at Bilbo, and before the Council of Elrond, when everybody's in Rivendell. At the end of his recitation of his song of Eärendil the Mariner, he gets a whole group of elves basically hectoring him about it and making fun of him. And I'm just going to read the conversation, because the whole thing is just a bunch of, back and forth, what the Tolkien professor would call hobbitry, them kind of playfully jabbing at each other. So one of them says, "Now we had better have it again," said an elf. Bilbo got up and bowed. "I am flattered, Lindir," he said, "but it would be too tiring to repeat it all." "Not too tiring for you," the elves answered, laughing. "You know you are never tired of reciting your own verses, but really we cannot answer your question at one hearing." "What?" cried Bilbo. "You can't tell which parts were mine and which were the Dunedain's?" "It is not easy for us to tell the difference between two mortals," said the elf. And this is clearly still joking, right? "Nonsense, Lindir," snorted Bilbo. "If you can't distinguish between a man and a hobbit, your judgment is poorer than I imagined. They're as different as peas and apples." "Maybe. To sheep, other sheep no doubt appear different," laughed Lindir. "Or to shepherds. But mortals have not been our study. We have other business." So, they have this whole back and forth where they're just kind of playfully bantering with each other. And that Bilbo is also joking, even if it doesn't seem like it on the surface, just reading it off the page, because he's literally going to tell Frodo in just a few more lines, all of it was mine, except Strider insisted on this one reference to a green stone, you know? So, I mean, he's obviously teasing Lindir the whole time. This is what I'm getting at, is like, elves are not at all just these stoic, emotionless, they aren't like that at all. And this is just one layer of how Legolas in the movies and Arondir and the other elves in, if anything, weirdly, Galadriel in the Rings of Power might be the most Elven in the sense that she actually shows emotion. I don't think she shows it very well, but that's a different story. But at least she actually has emotion. Whereas every other elf in like every other visual adaptation is just this emotionless, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, and maybe the classic example of this is, the scene in it's the Return of the King, really early on, when Pippin is about to look in the Palantir and Aragorn walks out and Legolas is just standing there and he's like, the stars are veiled. He's like, there's this sense of he's like a mysterious person with powers that humans can't comprehend, and like all elves are like this and they're all just stoic, and no, that's really not how they are. And just to give you another idea of how this works, think of the other things that we learn about elves. When Beren meets Luthien, she's not being some, proper English lady just out for tea. No, she's out dancing to music, and that's what makes him fall in love with her. And for Tolkien, this was a big deal because that's part of what he loved about Edith, was her dancing. Elves are passionate. They are very passionate. Now that can manifest in a lot of ways. For Feanor, it manifested in a lot of anger. For Fingolfin, it also manifested in a lot of anger. When basically all of, the free peoples, the elves and men, seemed like they were doomed because Morgoth had basically won the battle of the Dagor Bragollach, Fingolfin gets in a real rage. It says, Then Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses, and filled with wrath and despair, he mounted upon Rochalor, his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dornufalglith like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Orome himself was come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Feanor, of course, very famously goes kind of half crazy when the Silmarils are stolen. Elves really don't seem to do anything halfway. They're either very lighthearted or very serious, but not in a stoic way. For example, when Gildor and his elves hear the question from Pippin, can you tell us about Black Riders? They all get like, what are you talking about? Like, they get to the point of like, we don't even really want to tell you more than we absolutely have to because we're afraid it's going to make you not want to go forward, and you really shouldn't do that either. And then Frodo, of course, is like, now you're scaring me even worse. How could it be worse to tell me more at this point? So elves are not at all like what Legolas or Arondir or any of these characters are in Tolkien's world. That's just, and I don't know where anybody got this idea. But just to give you an idea of how multifaceted elves are, read the descriptions of Glorfindel and Elrond at the feast that they give for Frodo after he wakes up. Glorfindel was tall and straight, his hair was of shining gold, his face fair and young and fearless and full of joy. His eyes were bright and keen, and his voice like music. On his brow sat wisdom, and in his hand was strength. The face of Elrond was ageless, neither old nor young, though in it was written the memory of many things, both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were grey as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. Venerable he seemed as a king crowned with many winters, and yet hale as a tried warrior in the fullness of his strength. He was the lord of Rivendell and mighty among both elves and men. So there's contrasting, seemingly paradoxical elements to both of these elves. They're both young and old. They're both strong and old and wise. There's a lot of things going on in these descriptions that give you the idea of what elves are really like. And there's no getting around the fact that Tolkien's elves are not like what we typically see in adaptations. And I also want to address this thing about them being so tied up with nature. Like, this is a thing in the Rings of Power. We get this scene with Arondir where they're being forced to cut down a tree, and he goes up and he like puts his hand on it and like mourns it. And then there's also the stuff in I want to say in the, it's not exactly as, it's not the same kind of thing, but in the Lord of the Rings movies, and especially in The Hobbit, you definitely get the sense from the aesthetics and from the way that they do things that they are also kind of similarly not, they're trying to be almost environmentalist in their desire not to do anything to nature. Like their buildings are kind of built around trees, and that makes sense in Lothlorien, but it seems like they even do that a little bit in Rivendell. There's also a scene in The Hobbit, and this might only be in the extended version, I don't remember for sure, but in the Hobbit movies, we get the scene in Rivendell where the elves are all serving salad, and the dwarves are complaining about where's the meat. It's like, this idea that elves would only eat salad because they wouldn't want to kill animals, which seems to be kind of the implication. Maybe that's not exactly what Peter Jackson was going for, but it's still such a strange contrast. Like, the Sons of Feanor, some of them were known as being hunters. You don't hunt just for sport. You hunt for meat because it's food. And in a pre-industrial society, it's really hard to sustain any kind of a large population on plants alone. It really is. Whether you like to admit that or not, I mean, if you're a vegetarian, I'm not criticizing you, but being a vegetarian is really difficult if you don't have industrial level farming. It's just really hard to get enough nutrients and calories, especially in a society where you have to, put on a suit of armor and go out and fight in it for possibly hours. Like, you can't sustain that on even grains. Now, Limbus, okay, special case, but like very few people had Limbus to just munch on in the middle of a battle, right? That's a rare thing. So that does not get around the problem. But we have this idea here, on the one hand, in some of these visual adaptations, but on the other hand, we know that elves would chop down trees. Like, they built ships with lumber. This is a thing. We know they did this. And we also know, like I said, that some of the Sons of Feanor were hunters. They were hunters even in Valinor. So it's not like, they were some kind of weird, abnormal, twisted versions of elves in Valinor, or that they just started doing this in Middle-earth. No, this was a thing in Valinor, because even Orome is a hunter. Now, mostly Orome hunted monsters and bad creatures and whatnot. But he also, they were hunting in Orome's forest in Valinor. Obviously, that wouldn't have gone on if that was, a bad thing, right? So, elves in Tolkien's world are not tree huggers. That's not to say that they don't love nature. They love everything about Middle-earth. They do. But they also love the things that they can do with it. Now, in fairness to the Rings of Power, I will say there is a sense in which the tree that Arondir and the other elves are being forced to cut down, it's a wanton destruction. There's no real purpose to it because they're just digging this trench, which could go around, or, even if it can't go around, it's like the purpose of the trench just seems so, A, useless, or B, bad. I mean, there's really no good use for the trench. Of course, we don't even really find out what the trench is for till the end of season 1, and then we find out it really is bad. But the point is, from Arondir's perspective, it's just a needless destruction of a tree. So, I'm not saying that he's wrong to be mournful of the waste, because Tolkien does give us elements of that too. Like in his abandoned story of the Fourth Age, the New Shadow, there is this comment by the main character of, things like, just ruining apples or throwing fruit on the ground to not be used, to just go to waste, is orc work. This is bad. Wasteful destruction of nature is bad. So there is a sense that, Arondir might legitimately be sad about the fact that they're just wantonly destroying a tree, But this absurd reverence for trees is what I'm getting at. That's over the top. And the idea that elves would only eat salads in the Hobbit movies, it's just like, what? Where are you where are you people getting these ideas even? So at the end of this, the main point I'm trying to get at is no, Arondir is not the elfiest elf to ever elf. I mean, he's just not. Neither is Legolas, neither is Elrond, neither is Galadriel, none of them are. None of these characters really match up with the description of elves that we get from Tolkien's writings. Remember, we do have to think about the fact that we mostly see elves in specific contexts. When we see them in battle, yes, they are deadly, they are wrathful, they are, they're doing really crazy stuff and fighting like Balrogs and all this other. But that's when they're in battle. When they're not in battle and they're doing perfectly normal things, they're joyful, happy, and even like childlike in their mirth. Then they love to make jokes at each other, and they, I mean, they are extremely well rounded as people because they don't like most humans reach this point where they're just old and tired of everything, and we just get kind of grumpier as we get older. They maintain so much of their love and passion for Middle Earth and the things that they can do in it that they are at once angry at things that go against that, but also just absurdly joyful and even silly about their joy about the world around them, because to them it's still this wonderful, marvelous thing. Whereas for most of us, we kind of lose that as we get older. Children are very different. Just look at a baby experiencing new things and imagine what that would feel like as an adult. And then think of that as, kind of how elves are, but a little different because it's more mature. That's the kind of thing that they're experiencing. So this idea that they're just stoic, really competent warriors who never really feel hardly any emotion, and it annoyed me to no end because everybody was, and it didn't annoy me because it's Rings of Power. People think that Orlando Bloom's Legolas is really cool too, and I'm always just like, man, come on guys, that's not a Tolkienian elf at all, and he's not anything like the Legolas in the books. Of the two, in the movies, Gimli gets treated as the comedic half of the duo. In the books, it's really the opposite. It's because Legolas is the one who cracks jokes. But it just annoys me because everybody's like, oh, we're trying to make it look like Arondir's really this great elf representation. It's like, no, actually, there's really no visual representation at all that does a good job of showing us what an elf is like. So I wanted to go through this and give an idea of, if you really want to know what an elf is like, you need to see them in battle, you need to see them at home, you need to see them in company, you need to see them in various different contexts to get the real full picture. So, this is my attempt to show how complex and how really, like I said, multifaceted and well-rounded these people are. They're not anything like what we get in most of these visual adaptations. And I think we need to remember that when we're looking at, how do we critique visual adaptation characters, or in any others really. But not only that, but also remember it when we're just reading the book, or, maybe you play, a game like Journeys in Middle-earth where it's a role-playing style game and you're trying to role-play Legolas. Role-play Legolas with some jokes. Don't make him like Legolas in the movie. That's not Legolas. It really isn't. So, that's really the point. I just wanted to get that out there, and especially for those who haven't really deeply read the books, because there's a lot of people who really are only familiar with visual adaptations. And they aren't necessarily familiar with Gildor at all, and they don't know that Legolas cracked a joke on Caradhras. So there are people who don't know this, but all of us tend to forget it a little bit because it's hard to just reread the books and do it in a short enough time to really understand, oh yeah, like this, but this, but this, but this, but this. because they come at really far away points in the story for the most part. So it's valuable for all of us, but especially for those who haven't ever read the books or barely familiar with them. So hope you enjoyed this. Hope you either learned something new or were reminded of something that you should have known all along and maybe forgot. But if you got anything out of this video, please do give it a thumbs up. Share it around with other people who need to hear this, because I think a lot of people need to hear this. If you want to catch my future content, make sure you subscribe. If you're on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions on a regular basis, and check out the other support and social links in the description below. And until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Nathan Dufour, Paul Leone, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.